You've probably asked yourself this at some point, maybe late at night when everything is quiet and your thoughts get loud. Why does she only start missing me when I'm gone? Not when you were giving her your time, not when you were showing up consistently, not when you were making her life easier, lighter, better, but somehow, the moment you pull back, the moment you stop overextending yourself, that's when something shifts inside her. And I want you to understand something clearly from a woman's perspective, without sugarcoating it. Women don't miss comfort the way men think they do. They don't miss predictability. They don't miss a man who is always available at the cost of himself. What they miss is presence, value, and emotional impact. And those things are often invisible to you while you're busy trying to do everything right. So today, I'm going to walk you through exactly how women start missing the man they once took for granted. Not based on fantasies, not based on manipulation, but rooted in real psychology, real behavior, and yes, a little bit of stoic truth that most men ignore. Keep an open mind, because some of what you'll hear might challenge the way you've been approaching relationships entirely. And if you're serious about becoming the kind of man who is respected, remembered, and never easily replaced, then subscribe, because this is not surface-level advice. This is about understanding the game beneath the surface. Let's get into it. 1. You stopped making her the center of your world. There's a quiet shift that happens when a man slowly starts orbiting around a woman. At first, it feels natural. You like her, so you prioritize her. You make time, you check in, you adjust your schedule. But over time, without even realizing it, your life begins to shrink around her presence. Your goals become secondary, your routines become flexible, your identity starts to blur into the guy who is always there. And here's the truth most men don't want to hear. That's exactly when she starts taking you for granted. When everything revolves around her, she stops feeling chosen and starts feeling like she's the default. And nothing kills attraction faster than becoming predictable in your availability. This isn't about playing games, it's about understanding human nature. Scarcity creates value, not because it's manipulative, but because it forces awareness. Think about it this way. When you had your own rhythm, your own purpose, your own direction, she had to fit into your world. There was something to earn, something to align with. But the moment you made her the center, she no longer had to move toward you. You were already there. This is where Stoic philosophy cuts through the noise. Marcus Aurelius wrote about the importance of maintaining your inner citadel, a space within you that remains untouched and self-governed. When you abandon that, when your emotional state depends entirely on another person, you lose something essential, not just in her eyes, but in your own. So when you finally pull back, when you recenter your life around your mission, your discipline, your growth, she feels it immediately, not because you told her, but because your energy changes, your time becomes limited again, your attention becomes intentional again, and suddenly she starts noticing the absence of what she once assumed was permanent. Let me ask you something. If you disappeared from her routine tomorrow, would she feel a gap? Or would everything just continue smoothly? That question alone tells you everything you need to know. 2. You became emotionally unavailable, but not bitter. Now, this is where a lot of men get it wrong. They hear "be less available" and immediately swing to the extreme. They become cold, distant, dismissive, almost as if they're punishing the woman for not appreciating them. But that's not power. That's wounded ego disguised as control. What actually makes a woman start missing you is not emotional withdrawal driven by resentment. It's emotional discipline. There's a difference. When you stop oversharing, when you stop constantly seeking validation, when you stop reacting to every little shift in her behavior, you create space. And in that space, something interesting happens. She starts leaning in. Why? Because emotional consistency without overexposure is rare. Epictetus taught that we should focus only on what we can control, our actions, our responses, our mindset. When you stop trying to control how she feels about you and instead master how you carry yourself, you become grounded. and grounded men are not easy to replace. Before, maybe you were always explaining yourself, always trying to fix things, always trying to make her understand your intentions. But now, you speak when it matters. You listen more. You don't chase emotional reassurance. And here's what she experiences on the other side of that shift. She starts wondering what you're thinking. She starts questioning where she stands. She starts replaying moments, analyzing conversations, trying to reconnect with the emotional access she once had so easily. But here's the key. You're not doing this to manipulate her. You're doing this because you've realized something deeper. Your emotional energy is not something to hand out endlessly. Seneca talked about the importance of guarding your time and attention, because once given, they cannot be reclaimed. The same applies to your emotional investment. When you give it too freely, without boundaries, it loses its weight. But when you give it with intention, with restraint, it gains value. So when you become emotionally composed instead of emotionally reactive, she doesn't feel pushed away. She feels the distance, and that distance makes her reflect. Let me challenge you with this. Are you expressing yourself because it's meaningful, or because you're afraid of losing her? Because those two things create completely different outcomes, and women can feel the difference, even if they can't always explain it. When you stop overextending emotionally, not out of anger, but out of self-respect, you become someone she can no longer read so easily. And what people can't easily read, they start thinking about. That's where missing you begins. 3. You remove the safety net she never appreciated. There's a certain kind of comfort a woman feels when she knows deep down that no matter what she does, you'll still be there. You'll still text. You'll still check in. You'll still forgive. You'll still wait. And at first, she may even tell herself that she values that stability. But over time, something else creeps in. Complacency. Because when there are no consequences, there is no urgency. When you were always available, always understanding, always willing to tolerate behaviors that didn't sit right with you, you unintentionally created a safety net beneath her actions. She could pull away without losing you. She could test boundaries without real risk. And eventually, she stopped seeing your presence as something earned and started seeing it as something guaranteed. Now here's where everything changes. The moment you remove that safety net, not dramatically, not emotionally, but quietly and firmly, she feels the ground shift beneath her. You're no longer reacting the same way. You're no longer chasing to restore connection. You're no longer tolerating what drains you. And that absence of reassurance forces her to confront something she never had to face before: the possibility of losing you. Seneca once said that we suffer more in imagination than in reality, and this is exactly what begins to happen inside her mind. She starts imagining life without your consistency, your presence, your energy, and because she never truly processed your value while you were there, she now has to process it in your absence. But let me make this clear. Removing the safety net is not about punishing her. It's about respecting yourself. It's about recognizing that your time, your attention, and your emotional investment are not things to be endlessly given without reciprocation. When you finally stand on that principle, not aggressively, but calmly, you become unpredictable in the best way. Not unstable, but no longer guaranteed. And that's when she begins to question everything. Why isn't he reacting the same way anymore? Why isn't he trying to fix this? Did I push too far? Let me ask you something. Have you been so consistent that she never had to worry about losing you, even when she should have? Because if the answer is yes, then understand this. Being taken for granted is not always something done to you. Sometimes it's something you allowed, and the moment you stop allowing it, the dynamic changes. 4. You redirected your energy into your own growth. There is nothing more noticeable than a man who stops pouring all his energy into a woman and starts investing it back into himself. At first, she might not even recognize what's happening. She just notices that you're less available, you're busier, you're more focused, your conversations are shorter but more grounded. You're not lingering, you're not hovering, you're not waiting for her attention. And slowly, curiosity begins to build. Because the man she once had easy access to is now moving with purpose. This is where most men underestimate the power of self-development. They think it's something you do for yourself alone, separate from relationships. But the truth is, your growth changes how people experience you. It changes your posture, your tone, your decisions, your boundaries. It changes the way you respond and the way you don't. Epictetus emphasized that a man should be focused on improving his own character rather than seeking approval from others. And when you embody that, you become anchored. You're no longer chasing validation, you're building something real. Now, from her perspective, this shift creates a gap. Before, she knew exactly where your energy was going. It was going to her. Now she doesn't. And that uncertainty creates a tension. She starts wondering what you're working on, who you're becoming, what's taking your focus, and more importantly, why she's no longer the center of it. But here's the deeper layer. When you invest in yourself, you don't just become more attractive externally, you become more fulfilled internally, and that changes your standards. You're no longer willing to accept situations that don't align with your growth. So even if she tries to reconnect, she's not meeting the same version of you. She's meeting someone more grounded, more selective, more self-assured. Let me challenge you here. Are you building a life that a woman would be excited to be part of? Or are you waiting for a woman to give your life meaning? Because those are two completely different paths. And only one of them leads to respect. When she sees you evolving without needing her validation, something shifts inside her. Because now, your presence is no longer tied to her approval. It's tied to your purpose. And that's when she starts feeling like she might have underestimated you. 5. You stopped explaining your value. There's a phase many men go through where they feel the need to constantly prove themselves. They explain their intentions. They justify their actions. They try to make a woman understand why they are worth her time, her attention, her respect. And on the surface, it seems logical. You think, if she just understands me, she'll appreciate me. But that's not how it works. Value that needs to be explained often feels like value that isn't fully embodied. When you were constantly explaining yourself, you were operating from a place of seeking recognition. You wanted her to see what you bring, to acknowledge your effort, to validate your presence. But in doing so, you gave away something crucial, your position. Because a man who knows his value doesn't need to constantly articulate it. He demonstrates it through his standards, his boundaries, and his actions. Marcus Aurelius wrote about living in accordance with your principles rather than seeking approval from others. And that's exactly what this shift is about. You stop trying to convince and you start being. Now, from her perspective, this is disorienting. Before, she had access to your thoughts, your intentions, your reasoning. Everything was laid out clearly. But now, you move with quiet confidence. You don't over-explain. You don't over-justify. You don't chase understanding. And that creates a kind of tension because now she has to interpret your actions rather than rely on your explanations. She has to feel your value instead of being told about it. And here's the truth. What people feel stays with them longer than what they are told. So when you stop explaining your worth and instead live it, she begins to reevaluate everything she once overlooked. Let me ask you something that might be uncomfortable. Are you trying to be understood, or are you trying to be respected? Because those two things often require very different behaviors. And when you shift from explaining to embodying, you step into a level of presence that doesn't beg for attention. It commands it. That's when she starts to realize that what she had wasn't as replaceable as she once thought. 6. You became comfortable walking away. This is where everything either solidifies or falls apart. Because at the core of being taken for granted is one simple belief. She thinks you won't leave. Not necessarily because she doesn't care about you, but because your actions have consistently shown that you'll tolerate discomfort to keep the connection alive. You'll compromise your standards. You'll ignore your instincts. You'll stay, even when something doesn't feel right. And once that belief sets in, your leverage disappears. But the moment you become genuinely comfortable with walking away, not as a tactic, not as a threat, but as a real option, everything changes. Because now your presence is a choice, not a dependency. Seneca spoke about freedom as the ability to detach from outcomes. When you're no longer afraid of losing her, you stop operating from fear. You stop overcompensating. You stop negotiating your self-respect. And from her perspective, this shift is undeniable. She feels it in your tone, in your decisions, in your willingness to disengage from situations that don't align with you. You're no longer trying to hold everything together. You're willing to let things fall apart if they're not right. And that creates a level of respect that cannot be faked. Because now, she knows something she didn't fully believe before. You can leave. Let me ask you directly. If she continued treating you the same way for the next 6 months, would you stay? If the honest answer is yes, then understand this. She can feel that. And as long as she feels that, there is no urgency to change. But when you reach a point where your standards matter more than your attachment, you shift into a different category of man. Not because you're trying to impress her, but because you're no longer willing to abandon yourself. And that's when she starts to feel the weight of your absence before it even happens. Because now losing you is no longer theoretical, it's real. 7. She starts comparing you to what came after. This is where reality quietly does its work. When you were in her life, your presence became familiar. Your effort became expected. Your consistency blended into the background of her routine. And because of that familiarity, she didn't measure your value accurately. She experienced it, but she didn't register it. But once you're gone, or once you've pulled back enough to no longer be accessible in the same way, she inevitably encounters contrast. Maybe it's through another man. Maybe it's through the absence of someone who shows up the way you did. Maybe it's through silence where your presence used to be. But one way or another, comparison begins. And here's the truth most men overlook. People rarely understand value in isolation. They understand it through contrast. When the next man doesn't listen the way you did, doesn't lead the way you did, doesn't carry himself with the same grounded energy, she starts to feel the difference. Not in theory, but in experience. And that's when your absence becomes louder than your presence ever was. Marcus Aurelius spoke about how we often fail to appreciate what we have until we lose it, because we are too close to it to see it clearly. And that's exactly what happens here. Distance creates clarity. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. This realization doesn't always come quickly. Sometimes it takes time. Sometimes it takes disappointment. Sometimes it takes her going through situations that make her reflect on what she once dismissed. And during that time, you are not part of her daily life anymore. So let me ask you something that requires honesty. Are you living in a way that, when compared to others, your absence would feel like a downgrade? Because that's what creates lasting impact. Not perfection, not constant availability, but a standard of presence that is difficult to replace. When she starts comparing, she's not just thinking about you. She's feeling the difference between what she had and what she has now. And that feeling is what turns into missing you. 8. She realizes you weren't replaceable. You were rare. Attraction can make someone feel special in the moment, but rarity, that's what lingers. When you were always there, always accessible, always giving, it was easy for her to assume that what you offered could be found elsewhere, not necessarily because she believed it deeply, but because she never had to question it. But once she steps outside of your presence, once she experiences other interactions, other dynamics, other energies, she starts to recognize something she didn't fully see before. What you brought wasn't common. It might have been your consistency, your calmness under pressure, your ability to listen without judgment, your sense of direction, your emotional stability, or even the way you carried yourself without needing constant validation. These traits are not as widespread as people like to believe. Epictetus emphasized that true strength lies in self-mastery, in the ability to remain steady regardless of external circumstances. And when a man embodies that, he becomes rare, not flashy, not loud, but grounded in a way that stands out over time. And here's the part that hits her. She starts to realize that what she once treated as ordinary was actually uncommon. And now that she doesn't have access to it in the same way, she feels the absence more intensely. But let's be clear about something. Rarity is not something you declare. It's something that reveals itself through consistency over time. So ask yourself this: are you developing qualities that are genuinely hard to find? Or are you relying on effort alone to stand out? because effort without identity fades. But character, that leaves a mark. When she begins to see you as rare, not because you told her, but because her experiences confirmed it, missing you becomes less about nostalgia and more about recognition. She's not just missing you as a person, she's missing what you represented. 9. You didn't chase her. You chose yourself. This is the final shift, and it's the one that ties everything together. At the beginning, maybe you were chasing, not necessarily in a desperate way, but in a way that placed her above your own alignment. You prioritized her responses, her moods, her attention. You adjusted yourself to maintain connection. And slowly, without realizing it, you moved away from yourself. But at some point, something changed. You stopped chasing not because you gave up, but because you woke up. You realized that constantly pursuing someone who doesn't fully meet you where you are is not love, it's imbalance. You realize that your value is not determined by how someone responds to you, but by how you show up for yourself. Seneca wrote that a man should stand firm in his own worth, regardless of external validation. And when you embody that, you stop negotiating your standards for temporary connection. So now you choose yourself. You choose your time, your peace, your growth, your direction. And from her perspective, this is the most powerful shift of all, because now your absence is not a reaction to her behavior. It's a reflection of your standards. You didn't leave to make her miss you. You left because staying would have meant abandoning yourself. Let me ask you something that might change how you see everything. If choosing her means losing yourself, is that really a choice worth making? When you genuinely choose yourself, not as a tactic but as a principle, you become someone who cannot be easily forgotten, not because you tried to leave an impression, but because you refused to stay where you were not fully valued. And that's what lingers. That's what stays in her mind long after you're gone. That's what turns into missing you in a way that is deeper than surface-level attraction. Because now, she's not just thinking about what you did for her. She's thinking about the man who walked away and didn't look back. The truth about being remembered. At the end of all this, I want you to understand something that most men never fully accept. Being missed is not about making someone feel your absence through tricks or strategies. It's about becoming someone whose presence had weight and whose absence creates reflection. Every point we've talked about comes back to one core idea. When you stop abandoning yourself to maintain connection, you naturally become more impactful. Not because you're trying to be, but because you're aligned. So if there's one thing you take from this, let it be this. Do not build your life around being needed. Build your life around being grounded, purposeful, and self-respecting. The kind of man who can love deeply, but never at the cost of himself. Because when you become that man, you don't have to worry about being missed. It happens naturally. Subscribe if you're ready to keep growing into that version of yourself and come back for the next video.